Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Some Stops Along the Way, your podcast that explores some of the most interesting countries in the world through the lens of my work there, as well as focusing on their history, their culture, and their geopolitics. And today we are going to continue under the thematic area of Islam's fault line and look at another supremely interesting country of Kuwait. But before we get into that, I want to tell you about the next thematic area that we're going to address. Today's episode is actually the last episode in the thematic area of Islam's fault line. We've looked at some very fascinating countries throughout the Islamic world, whether they be in North Africa, the Middle East, Asia, and focused on the nexus of their history, culture, geopolitics, and religion. Now we're beginning in the episode right after this one. We're going to enter another thematic area that I call times of joy and times of sorrow. And this will cover a period and a group of countries in which I worked in my career where I learned profound lessons and where there were times of great joy, but also times of great sorrow for different reasons. These countries made a profound impact on me. They continually reminded me of my own potential, but also of my own limitations. And so I think you'll enjoy the thematic area of times of joy and times of sorrow. It'll make you laugh, it'll make you cry, but most of all, it'll make you think. And that's what the Some Stops Along the Way podcast is meant to do, after all. Of course, you can find out more about the countries where I've worked and all the thematic areas that I cover on the podcast in my memoir, Some Stops Along the Way, which is available on Amazon. Right now, I want to jump, though, into the final country under Islam's fault line, and that is the country of Kuwait. If I could title this episode, it would be A Small Nation at the Crossroads, because Kuwait is a very small country. I remember the first time that I visited Kuwait. It was in the summer and the heat was profound. In fact, the heat is probably the thing I remember the most of that initial visit. It is an interesting country, but it's one in many ways that has a similar trajectory of many of the countries around it. Its economy is based largely on oil. It sits at the crossroads of the world. It's a country that's been heavily influenced by outside forces. It's a country where conflict has defined its trajectory, but also a country that has a great deal of potential and that punches above its weight as far as regional geopolitics goes. So let's delve into this country. There's a moment in Kuwait just before the sun rises when the whole country seems to be quiet at one time. The Gulf is as flat as a glass. The air is cool for a few fleeting minutes, and believe me, it's just for a few. And the city, usually humming with traffic and construction and the rhythm of daily life, is quiet enough that you can hear the water tapping against the rocks along the Corniche. That's when I used to like to walk and enjoy the relative coolness, enjoy the quiet, and then return to my hotel or later on my guest house before the city erupted into heat and chaos. I learned that if you stand there long enough, watching that first light hit the skyline, you start to understand something that's essential about this place. You see, Kuwait doesn't overwhelm you. It doesn't have the glitz of Dubai or the United Arab Emirates. It doesn't have the the spectacle of Riyadh or Saudi Arabia. It doesn't have the glamour of Qatar and Doha. It doesn't demand your attention. Kuwait, and especially its capital, Kuwait City, reveals itself slowly in layers, like a story that knows its own worth but doesn't need to shout. You see, Kuwait is a country shaped by contrast. A desert land built on the sea, a small nation surrounded by giants, a people who have known both extraordinary prosperity and sudden, devastating loss. And yet there's a steadiness in Kuwait, a quiet confidence that comes from centuries of navigating the space between worlds. From the days when Kuwaiti sailors crossed the Indian Ocean on wooden dhows, to years when pearl divers risk everything for a single perfect gem, to the modern era of to the modern era rather of oil, wealth, invasion, liberation, and rebuilding. Kuwait has been many things. It's been a trading hub, a protectorate, a battlefield, a democracy in a region where the word is rare. If you could sum up Kuwait in one word, and I've often been asked to do this, it would be a survivor. But before all of that, before the geopolitics and the headlines, Kuwait was and still is a community built on resilience, hospitality, and a deep sense of identity. So, as I used to enjoy the sun rising over Kuwait City, and before the heat began its daily climb, I used to speculate on what had been and what could be. And today I want to walk through this story with you together. Because it's not just a story of oil or war or diplomacy, it's a story of people who have learned to live at the crossroads of history. So let's take a breath, feel the stillness before the heat, and let's begin. Like I said, Kuwait is not one of those places that shouts for attention. It's a country that sits kind of quietly at the northwestern corner of the Persian Gulf, a sliver of land between the giants of Iraq to the north, Saudi Arabia to the south, and Iran across the water. And yet, this small emirate has been a crossroads of civilization for thousands of years. A maritime hub, a desert refuge, a pearl diving society, a British protectorate, a petrostate, a battlefield, and today, a diplomatic and humanitarian force in the Gulf. Does that sound familiar? Does it sound like Qatar? Does it sound like Saudi Arabia? It has a very similar trajectory, believe me. When you stand at the waterfront in Kuwait City and you watch those dhows glide across the bay, and you can still see that today, this juxtaposition of the ancient and the modern. When you do that, you're looking at a country that's always lived between worlds, the desert and the sea, tradition and modernity, vulnerability and resilience. The land before Kuwait really holds the key to the emergence of the modern country. You see, archaeology tells us that Kuwait's story begins long before the modern state, long before Islam, long before the Al Saba family, even long before the first Bedouin tribe settled on the coast. Human habitation in Kuwait dates back to nearly 8,000 BC, with Mesolithic tools discovered in the Bergen area. By the Ubaid period of 6500 BC, Kuwait was a maritime bridge between Mesopotamia and Eastern Arabia. Sites like Barawan and H3 in Subaya reveal some of the world's earliest seafaring communities, including one of the earliest reed boats ever found on the planet. Failaka Island, just off the coast, became a settlement for Mesopotamians around 2000 BC, with traders from the Sumerian city of Ur establishing a mercantile outpost. Failaka would later host Dilmun, Greek, and Hellenistic influences, a reminder that Kuwait has always been more than the desert. It's always been a meeting place of peoples and cultures. Modern Kuwait traces its origins to the 18th century, when the Utub tribe settled along the coast around 1716, establishing what would become Kuwait City. The community chose the Al Saba family to lead, a decision that set the tone for Kuwait's political culture: consultative, pragmatic, and rooted in consensus. By the 19th century, Kuwait became a major maritime hub. Its sailors built sturdy wooden dhows, trading across the Gulf to India, East Africa. Pearling, fishing, and shipbuilding defined the economy and shaped Kuwait's identity. But facing pressure from the Ottoman Empire and regional rivals, Kuwait signed a treaty with Great Britain in 1899, becoming a protected state while retaining internal autonomy. This treaty preserved Kuwait's independence and set the stage for its modern geopolitical role. Of course, like other countries in the Gulf and North Africa to a certain degree, one thing changed the trajectory of the entire country, and that was the discovery of oil in the 1930s. It wasn't until after World War II, though, that the first shipment of oil left Kuwait. That was in 1946. And then in a single generation, Kuwait transformed from a modest port town into one of the world's wealthiest nations. Kuwait gained full independence from Britain on June 19, 1961, joining the Arab League and the United Nations soon after. In 1962, its constitution established a parliamentary system that blended traditional leadership with democratic participation, which is a rarity in the Gulf. Of course, much of what we know about modern Kuwait comes from the 1990 invasion, when Iraq invaded Kuwait. And the reason for this invasion was that Iraq claimed economic grievances and territorial rights against Kuwait. The occupation lasted for 7 months, and it was marked by repression, destruction, and the burning of Kuwait's oil fields. Of course, we know that the United States and other allied forces intervened, and a U.S. led coalition liberated Kuwait in February of 1991. And the country spent more than $5 billion repairing its oil infrastructure. You know, the interesting thing about the 1990 invasion, if you read Queen Noor's book about her husband, King Hussein of Jordan, you know that King Hussein integrated himself, if you will, as an intermediary between Kuwait and the other Arab states and Iraq during this time. And he very much tried to convince Saddam Hussein not to invade Kuwait. He made several trips to Baghdad to implore Saddam to rethink his stated goal of invading Kuwait. And Queen Noor shares in this book at one point that King Hussein left Baghdad with an agreement from Saddam Hussein that he would not invade Kuwait. And before he even got back to Jordan, Saddam had already crossed the border, and Iraqi tanks and infantry divisions were rolling across Kuwait. And this frustrated King Hussein greatly. And really, according to Queen Noor, led to his examination of the incongruity of Arab leaders. He was very much disturbed, not just by the invasion itself, but by the fact that Saddam Hussein did not deal with him in a transparent way. Maybe King Hussein never should have expected that. But as an Arab leader to an Arab leader, I think that King Hussein felt that Saddam's word meant something, which of course he found out that it did not. But this devastating war, albeit a short one from August of 1990 to February of 1991, left a deep imprint on Kuwaiti identity, a reminder of its vulnerability, but also of its unity and international support. I'm going to talk more about the effects of that war in Kuwait. But first, I want to back up just a little bit and focus on Kuwait's culture, society, and identity, which I found to be quite interesting during my work there. Kuwait's culture is shaped by two environments. Of course, it's the desert on one hand and the sea on the other. The desert fostered Bedouin values of hospitality, resilience, and community, while the sea shaped Kuwaiti music, poetry, trade, and its purling economy. And of course, you can't talk about Kuwait or any country in this region without talking about Islam. Islam remains central to Kuwaiti values, law, and daily rhythms. Mosques historically serve as centers of worship, education, and community life. Family, charity, and respect for elders remain foundational in Kuwait, based on the principles of Islam. I found Islam in Kuwait to be a very moderate form of the religion, a very tolerant form of religion that sought to be inclusive rather than exclusive, that sought to be something of more beauty and light than chaos and darkness. But still, Islam permeates the society, even down to the traditional dress, the dishdasha for men and the abaya for women, which remains common to this day. And so you see all this cultural mosaic that's steeped in Islam. But you also look around you and you see a modern, globally connected society with higher education, digital culture, and contemporary arts. Very much like the small nation of Qatar that I discussed a few episodes ago. It's a real dichotomy as far as a country, and especially the capitals, Kuwait City and Doha in Qatar. From the standpoint of arts and cultural expression, Kuwait has long been a cultural pioneer in the Gulf. Its distinctive Saut music, rooted in maritime rhythms, remains a national treasure. It also is famous in theater, literature, and television, which has flourished throughout the 20th century. But of course, all of this gets overwhelmed in some ways by Kuwait's geopolitics. We all know that Kuwait lives in a bad neighborhood. It's surrounded by Iraq, Saudi Arabia, and Iran. Any way you look at it, that's going to be a very difficult place to exist. It also is at the head of the Persian Gulf, which, of course, is between Iraq and Saudi Arabia, and that shaped its politics. Kuwait has traditionally punched above its weight from a geopolitical standpoint. It's a founding member of the Gulf Cooperation Council, the GCC, and it often plays a role of mediator in regional disputes. It has tried very hard to maintain good relations with the countries around it, but of course, the relationship with Iraq eroded in the late 1980s, and that led to this 1990 invasion, which still cast a shadow over Kuwait's security posture, diplomacy, and defensive partnerships. Kuwait balances its ties with Saudi Arabia, its closest Gulf partner, and Iran, with whom it shares maritime boundaries. Its foreign policy is cautious, pragmatic, and oriented toward stability. Of course, Kuwait has a strong relationship with the United States. It was the United States and its allies, after all, that came to liberate Kuwait from Saddam Hussein in 1990. Kuwait is known for, pardon me, for many things, but humanitarian aid is one that is first and foremost. It's often ranked among the world's most generous donors relative to its GDP. And like the countries around it, especially Saudi Arabia, but then comparing other small Gulf nations like Qatar and the United Arab Emirates, Kuwait has a vision beyond just its current circumstances. Its Vision 2035, for instance, aims to reduce dependence on oil, expand infrastructure, and build a knowledge based economy. Does that sound familiar? It should, because Saudi Arabia is doing the same thing, Qatar is doing the same thing. This is one of the areas in which I worked when I was in Kuwait, helping them define major elements of Vision 2035. Again, this was not a country I worked in the long term, although I did in Saudi and Jordan and many other countries in the region. But my short term trips to Kuwait were focused on assisting the implementation of elements surrounding Vision 2035. This vision is one that is very, I would say, pragmatic. Kuwait realizes that as a small country, it has to move beyond the the benefits of the oil-based economy. Oil changed everything for Kuwait, as I said before. But its dependence on oil and the revenues that it generates, while it's built a modern society, Kuwait's rulers realize that fossil fuel ultimately is not sustainable. At some point in time, it runs out. And what happens then? They've already been through a situation where things like pearl diving were important before the 1920s when Japan developed cultured pearls, and the pearl uh, and raw pearls were no longer desired, tanking its economy. It never wants to be in that situation again. So while most of us can't conceive really a world that doesn't operate on oil, Kuwait and other countries in the region have begun to look past that and define different areas of their economy where they can create economic growth outside of petroleum. Now, I told you when I worked in Saudi, the funny story about me being a one-day petroleum consultant when I didn't want to be because I don't know anything about petroleum. And so certainly I didn't try to advise the Kuwaitis on their petroleum industry. This is something they do well. They've got a lot of international partners. They don't need, even if I was a petroleum expert, they wouldn't need my assistance in that area. What we advise them on are things like the creation of a digital economy, tourism, light manufacturing, areas that will create revenues and trade opportunities outside of the petroleum economy. But in doing so, we still had this, we operated still, even years later, under this specter of war. My first trip to Kuwait, I came out of Saudi Arabia, and I was working in Kuwait City. Um, and a lot of the work we were doing was very substantive work. A lot of it was strict consulting work where we were helping, as I said, define the different areas in their Vision 2035. But in talking with Kuwaitis, the conversation would regularly turn to that dark period in 1990 when they were invaded and the brutality of the Iraqis during that invasion. I don't think psychologically the Kuwaitis have ever been able to move past that. Whether I was talking with men or women and people I respected very greatly, they would almost manifest surprise that a neighbor, even a neighbor that wasn't friendly, as Saddam Hussein was not, obviously, could act in such a brutal way. And I think they also, the common denominator is that they also showed a lot of surprise that their neighbors, like Saudi Arabia, were loath to really, on their own, do anything to stop Saddam Hussein. Now, remember, in 1990, the Iraqi economy was virtually destroyed by this egregious war with Iran during the 1980s, where literally hundreds of thousands of people were exterminated. Neither side really won the war. It became a stalemate, and the economies of both sides were just decimated. So Iraq was at a very low state economically. And who knows, you can't get inside of Saddam Hussein's brain. That would be a really bad neighborhood. Maybe his invasion of Kuwait was meant to restore the honor of the Iraqis coming off of this debilitating war with Iran. Maybe it was to take the population's focus off of the economy and put it on what he considered to be a common enemy. Maybe it was to stretch his muscles again in the Gulf region. Again, who knows? You can't really understand what Saddam Hussein was thinking. Certainly, if King Hussein of Jordan couldn't understand it, then there's no way for us as outside observers to understand it. But the Kuwaitis are still traumatized by this. They're still perplexed by it in many ways because no one, even with the gnashing of teeth and all of the rhetoric coming out of Iraq at that time, no one really expected Saddam Hussein to invade Kuwait. And certainly, I don't think Saddam Hussein anticipated the swift and direct response from the United States and its allied nations. Now remember, this was the time when the United States forces were commanded by a general named Norman Schwarzkopf. And Schwarzkopf believed, and he believed this because it was his order, that the mission of the United States and its coalition partners during that time was to liberate Kuwait. It was not to invade Iraq. It was not to topple the regime of Saddam Hussein. It was to liberate Kuwait. Now, could we have saved ourselves and the world a huge amount of angst if we had continued to roll into Iraq and facilitated regime change in 1991 instead of over a decade later? Absolutely. But the fact is, that wasn't the U.S. and the coalition's mandate. And Norman Schwarzkopf says in his book that they did exactly what they were supposed to do. They pushed the Iraqis out of Kuwait, liberated the country, and restored democratic governance in Kuwait. The impact of that and the decisions around that will probably be debated by political scientists for decades. But the fact is, as I said, that the U.S. and its coalition partners did exactly what they were supposed to do. And the Kuwaitis will be forever grateful. The ones certainly that I've sat with in cafes and in homes in Kuwait City and in other parts of the country will be forever grateful for the Americans and the coalition partners having liberated them from this specter of Iraqi invasion. But that doesn't end the trauma. It doesn't end the rebirth that Kuwait had to have after all that occurred. You can almost trick yourself nowadays walking through Kuwait City and how modern it is, and spending time on the Corniche and looking out into the Gulf, and your mind can start playing tricks on you that things are normal. Things are far from normal. They're far from normal in Kuwait. They're far from normal in Saudi Arabia. They're far from normal in Iraq and Iran and countries throughout the Middle East and North Africa. Because their version of normal is different than ours. Their version of normal always comes with a caveat. And that is everything is quote unquote normal until they're not. And that not could come at any time for any reason. Most recently, it's the war between Israel, the United States, and Iran, where missiles were fired by Iran into Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and Kuwait, even some in Jordan. So everything's normal until it's not. And so when you talk to Kuwaitis, there's always this specter of 1990 and how quickly things went bad. If they learned one thing from that period of time, I think that it was that how quickly normal can become abnormal. And the hyperspeed at which everyone's life can change indiscriminately. Based on that, I don't think the Kuwaiti psyche, or certainly that of those that I'm close with in Kuwait, will ever be the same. So we need to remember that even though Kuwait doesn't dominate the headlines the way its neighbors do, it's a significant country. It's a country that we need to understand as much as we can from the standpoint of onlookers. It has a beautiful story from ancient maritime crossroads to a modern petroleum state, from occupation to resilience. And if I had to sum all that up and juxtapose that with the conversations I've had with Kuwaitis throughout the country, it's that they have a quiet strength. And when you look at a country like Kuwait, it's a reminder that small nations can shape the world, not through size, but through endurance, diplomacy, and identity. I purposely saved Kuwait until the end of this thematic area of Islam's fault line. And I did that for several reasons. One is that Kuwait's story mirrors a lot of the stories in that region of the world with a similar history and culture, the integration of Islam, the involvement of the British, the integration of oil and gas into the economy, the fabulous wealth that brought to the region, juxtaposed with all the conflict and the pain and suffering that has led to Kuwait and other countries rethinking their entire political and economic strategies. So it's a good place to come to the finish line of this thematic area. Kuwait is very moderate, as I said, in terms of Islam. But this moderation has come with a cost. It's been very intentional. But the price of that moderation has been quite high. It's created friction with the Saudis, who are much more, or have been much more conservative. It created divides between Shias and Sunnis that at least in part led to the conflict with both Iraq and Iran at different points in time. It's led to a rethinking of its foreign policy, of its strategy for the future. And I'm very glad to say that Kuwait has made significant advances on its Vision 2035. It's put in place many of the elements it's going to need to move beyond the petroleum economy in the future. But as Saudi did, it got a very late start. It depended on oil revenues for decades. And in doing so, all the eggs being in that basket, any interruption in those revenues, even today, creates a significant disruption in society. So anyone who has visited Kuwait, and especially Kuwait City, don't let the look and feel of the place fool you. It's complicated. It's maddening in some ways. And yet it retains the hospitality and the culture of an ancient civilization that none of this conflict and none of the oil revenue and none of the modern buildings have been able to wipe out. And as we come to the end of this thematic area of Islam's fault line, we've talked a lot about these tectonic plates in Islam that have rubbed against each other and created things like Arab Spring, which was the earthquake within the Arab world in 2011. But we need to understand that these tectonic plates are still rubbing together today, and that we haven't seen the last of these geopolitical earthquakes in the Islamic world. And in some ways, as I said in a previous episode, there's a battle going on for the soul of Islam. There is the biggest war is likely not among countries in the region. It's among the ideology of Islam itself. And Kuwait is at the nexus of that. So it's a logical place to end, but also a logical place to serve as a segue to the next thematic area, which is times of joy and times of sorrow. Because it was in this region, North Africa and the Middle East, that I had so many times of joy and times of sorrow. Times when I sat in hotel rooms in Kabul and Jerusalem, in my house in Amman, and hotel in Riyadh, in Baghdad, Sana'a, that were times when I literally had to re-examine everything that I thought I knew about the business that I was in and everything I thought I knew about myself. And so this segue from Islam's fault line to times of joy and times of sorrow are indelibly linked together. So next Monday, we are going to start on this new theme, times of joy and times of sorrow, with a new country and the lessons that I learned there. But until then, I hope that you've learned something about Kuwait. I hope that you've learned something about the role of Islam in shaping the history, culture, and geopolitics of all of the countries that we've discussed. And more than that, I hope that it's made you think about your position and your knowledge of these countries and of Islam itself, and maybe even rethink some of the things that you thought you knew. I will look forward to seeing you next Monday for the first episode in our series, Times of Joy and Times of Sorrow. Until then, thanks for joining us on some stops along the way, and have a great, great week.